I'm cognizant that we're talking to people who have a particular interest in assessment. And so I wanted to bring Melissa Thomas into this conversation. So Melissa Thomas is not only the Queen of Rigor in the district, but she's also the point person for our Assessment for Learning grant that we have going on. And so I'll let her talk a little bit about that grant itself and then talk us through this slide right here.
So back in the fall of 2015, we kind of found out about this grant with the Assessment for Learning people, and we really got excited about the idea that somebody else was also talking about rethinking assessment, because it was something that I actually was brought on board through, not through the Race to the Top grant, but years ago when Georgia moved to the student learning objectives system. I was kind of put in charge of that movement here in the county when it came to creating assessments. And so that kind of segued us really nicely into, as a county, we were already rethinking assessment. We were not going like most districts in the state were with 25 multiple choice assessments for every single content area for every single grade level. We really approached that that process with experts in the field for each course, really talking through what their course content really looked like, sounded like, felt like, and how could you best assess that. So back in 2013, we were already starting to rethink the way that we were looking for assessment in our county, and we were starting to really think through the level of rigor that we wanted out of these assessments and what we really wanted students to be able to do by the end of a course. So in in the fall of 2015, when this came across, Erin asked me to kind of spearhead some of this work and really work through applying for this grant and thinking through how we could not just rethink assessment in terms of a paper pencil kind of assessment to give students or even a performance task, but what if we rethought assessment in terms of what a conversation looked like throughout a process. And so that turned us through the image that you see here on your screen, which is the quality feedback flow, that we're really trying to get people to start thinking through. If we're saying that student agency is the heart of our work, how do we start to measure, how do we start to track progress in student agency through this newish sort of a way of assessing? And so what you see here is the way, and I'm going to talk you through each one of these layers of the slide. It really starts with a competency. So starting with, if we know that students are supposed to, and students know they are supposed to demonstrate mastery of specific skills and competencies in a classroom, students having the agency, first of all, to understand what those competencies are, and then to be able to create a document or an authentic piece of work that demonstrates some type of mastery of that competency. So through this feedback flow, you see step one is understanding the competency. Step two would be to create a piece that demonstrates mastery of that competency. Step three then is, okay, now I want to submit it to someone and start assessing myself and where I think I land on the competency. So students within the learner profile submit their piece of work, and they can submit videos, they can submit hyperlinks, they can submit pictures, they can submit PDFs or Word documents of evidence of mastery, and then they have to rate themselves and explain why they're rating themselves the way that they are. One of the biggest pieces that this feedback flow interjects is students constantly having to explain their thinking behind why they chose that piece of work, or why they're rating themselves a certain way, or why they say that someone's feedback is helpful or not. So we're really getting to the heart of students being able to give their own voice to the process. So once a student rates their work, they then choose a peer, a teacher, someone within their building that they want to give them feedback on their work. This all happens digitally within the platform. And the teacher or the student, the peer, looks at the criteria and gives them feedback on their piece of work based on the competencies. Now, one of the biggest pieces about this, as right now we're working through this feedback loop with a pilot of teachers, and one of the biggest pieces of offering students feedback that we've had to talk through is the idea that right now feedback tends to be very, very specific, and so it doesn't necessarily feed a student forward. And if we're looking at agency over time, we really want their feedback to not be so specific in terms of make sure you're capitalizing all of your letters, or make sure that in this particular paragraph you insert this particular sentence, but that the feedback is holistic enough that the next time a student goes to create a piece of work, they are constantly thinking back to the previous feedback that they received. So in turn, it's feeding them forward throughout their competency. So once a teacher or a peer gives their student feedback on their work, the student themselves receives that feedback, and then they give it, out of 4 stars, they give it a star rating as to whether or not the feedback was helpful to them or not. And this is where the student again has to say, your feedback was helpful to me because, your feedback was not helpful because, and eventually those stars for a teacher will feed into a helpfulness rating, where over time teachers will start to see an aggregation of their scores, and they can start to see what type of feedback was helpful and what type of feedback was not helpful. And I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. So once students rate the feedback, then the student has to create an action plan based on the feedback that they've received. And it basically turns into a checklist where the students are thinking through, what feedback did I receive from my peers, from my teachers, and how am I then going to take that feedback and do something with it? Because again, it comes back to agency. Again, that goes back to the type of feedback that students are receiving, because if students are receiving do this, do this, do this, then the action plan is somewhat meaningless to a student, because all they're doing is repeating what their peers and their teacher has said to them. So we're really trying to encourage them to think bigger, think broader in terms of what types of questions can you ask students, so that when they go to develop an action plan, it's truly demonstrating student agency in that students are saying what they think they should do next. They then review that action plan with their teacher to say, these are the things that I think I'm going to do, and here's why I think I'm going to do it. The teacher then approves the feedback, or the action plan, excuse me, and then the student has time to revise their piece. They can then resubmit their piece, or they can continue the piece as is through the feedback loop. One of the really important pieces to that is, as we've been working with the pilot teachers, talking through, if a student's not receiving a lot of good holistic feedback, their action plan is going to be very minimal, and by the end, they may not need to resubmit their work because there was little feedback that was genuine enough to really change the outcome of that product. So there's a lot of pieces in here that really get back to the heart of, how are students going to do something with the feedback they're receiving? The other piece to this is that teacher helpfulness rating. As Karen and I sat with pilot teachers a couple of weeks ago, and we really started talking through this piece on student agency, we were also thinking through teacher agency and how that's playing out right now. How often do teachers give feedback to students, but they don't really know if it does anything for the student? Because oftentimes, we've talked about, feedback comes at the end of a product. It comes when the final rubric is given and students get to see where on the rubric they fell, but very little of, if any, qualitative feedback is given to a student. So this is starting to change practice for the teacher, and we want to see then if teacher agency is changing as well, in terms of, when you see that your feedback is not being rated as helpful, what are you going to do about that as a teacher? What types of conversations do you need to have? Do you have the type of agency that allows you to understand why students are saying what they're saying about your quality of feedback and how it can change your instructional practice in the classroom? But to go back to the student side for another minute, we're really helping students, and we're really hoping that the changing of where the feedback is happening, instead of being at the end of the process, being a part of the process, is going to change the conversation with students to say that the feedback shouldn't be coming at the end of the product. It should be part of the process. It should be a natural conversation between you and I, and this is just a digital way of capturing some of that. We've just begun the pilot with our teachers, so we've just really ramped our teachers up, and our teachers are going to get in. We've got 34 teachers. So we asked for 2 teachers from each pilot 15 and 16 school, cohort 15 and 16 schools, so 2 teachers from each of those groups. And then we had a volunteer from cohort 17. We have 2 teachers from one cohort 17 school, so we've got 34 teachers total. who are going to be taking students through this feedback flow. And another part of this work is one of the pieces that's going to happen, I think, naturally throughout this pilot is teachers are going to start to understand that the quality of the rigor of work that you're putting through this feedback flow is really going to determine the type of feedback you can offer a student on their work. So our teachers were really wrestling through on our pilot training day what piece of work could really qualify to go through this. And it's starting to change the conversation then. If a teacher chooses or a student chooses a worksheet, for example, of work that could go through the feedback flow, what type of feedback can you really offer on that? Versus if a student puts together an outline and says, this is what I think I want to do for my end product, I'd like some feedback on the outline before I even get started so that I know whether my direction is accurate or not. One of our teachers, after spending some time with us during the pilot training, really started thinking through, so you're not asking for the final product necessarily, so maybe I could have my students put their topic ideas through the feedback flow. And they could start to get feedback from their peers and from me on whether or not their topic is broad enough or too narrow, or what types of topics. And then once they're giving feedback to one another, how does that then change the outcome of their work as well? So part of the work with that action plan would be that we're going to hope to see some of the feedback that they're offering their peers come out in their action plan as well to say, oh, I saw someone else do this, and now I'm thinking I want to include an element of that in my work. So we're hoping all of this is just one way to capture work that should already be happening in a classroom, but a way for us to start to see where is this really happening, where are some breakdowns happening, how can it change both student and teacher agency throughout that process. I'm going to take a minute to kind of let that stop and soak in, and if you guys have any questions for me on what we're thinking here in terms of the feedback flow. So if you have any questions for me before we move on to anything else.
That was fantastic. So I'm going to start with Denise here.
Maybe give us some examples of what kind of projects your students are working on actually to show that competency. What are kids actually doing?
So I think that varies right now, to be very honest with you. Some of our schools are full-fledged working through competencies, and other of our schools, even though they might have been cohort 15 schools, are still kind of working through standards. So one of the requirements, because this feedback flow is based in the competencies, students are required to tie their work to a competency. We're asking for the purpose of the pilot for students to at least be tagging their work to the 21st century competencies. We feel like that's a really good in to start with. So the 21st century competencies being, again, collaboration, communication, critical thinking, and creativity. And so if students can at least take part of those competencies and tag their work, we're starting to work through this process of the feedback flow. So some of it right now, to be very honest, are things like, well, my students are going to create a PowerPoint about XYZ. So part of that goes back to then, okay, so is it rigorous, right? So the traditional PowerPoints that we're seeing right now in classrooms are your slides must include, slide 1 must be this, slide 2 must be this, slide 3 must be this. So again, when we go into the feedback flow, we say, okay, so what type of feedback then can you really offer a student when everything is so delineated for them? Other teachers, again, I go back to the topic idea. That is for a high school statistics course. The students, and I forget the end product that they're expected to complete, but that was when the teacher shifted his thinking to say, so maybe it's not the poster that I want to necessarily go through the feedback flow, but what I want to go through the feedback flow is the topic idea. So are students thinking broad enough, or are they too narrow, or where are they sitting in between for choosing their topic for this research project? Other teachers are thinking through, I'm trying to think of some more specific examples from our pilot time with them. We had one teacher shift from an idea of telling their students the 8 people that they had to research. And instead of telling the students the 8 people they had to research, allowing them to explore those 8 people through lower level DOK activities, and then through the feedback flow, taking students through which one of those 8 people was the most impactful for American society today. And so the students walking through that type of work to understand how historical figures, for example, influence American society. And that was in an elementary classroom for social studies. So it's different types of work that we're going to see through. We do have one Spanish teacher in the pilot, and I have not had a personal conversation with her. My colleague Jay has had some more in-depth conversations with her in terms of what she's thinking about her work. But each teacher through this pilot is going in a different direction with the work. And when they come back from winter break is when between, let's see, next Monday, the 27th, to our spring break, the 5 weeks in between that time, we're asking our pilot teachers to take one piece of work through the feedback flow at least one time. And students must receive feedback from one peer and one teacher to see how the feedback flow works and to see what type of work we're getting through the system.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
That's a very interesting process, because when I first started listening to you, I was thinking that the student was just choosing whatever, I mean their own, but then as you start talking about it, and it's teachers guidance, but not too much.
So eventually we would hope we can move more to the students looking at their competency and showing a teacher how I want to demonstrate mastery of that. When we started working on the pilot teachers, however, we recognized that a lot of them were just not there yet in looking at the competencies and allowing students the complete autonomy, the complete agency to say, here's how I want to demonstrate mastery of that. So again, we went back to where our meeting teachers where they are currently, and saying, okay, so where then are you going to allow students to demonstrate agency through this? Because as we saw even from the beginning of the day during training, it was on a Wednesday, from the beginning of the day during training to the end of the day, the shift in their thinking from here's the project, here's the 5 things I want you to do in that project, to now, oh wait, you're saying I can kind of open this up a little bit more, I can kind of be a little bit more free about it, really started to lead the teachers in this idea of, in order for it to become more rigorous, there does need to be a more authentic approach to it, and the only way you can really get to an authentic approach to the work is to allow students the autonomy to say, here's what I'm thinking about this, and let me get some feedback on whether or not my thinking is on the right track or I'm kind of veering off into left field somewhere. So this pilot really is an interesting study even in adult teacher behavior, in allowing them the agency to allow them to shift from here's what I was thinking at first and now here's what I'm thinking, and then at the end of the pilot saying, so where did you end up going with this as opposed to where you thought you were starting with this. And our thinking in the pilot was if we can get 2 people really championing this cause, and what we were asking, we asked our project managers and our coaches to really identify these teachers and to ask them if they would be willing to participate. We wanted people who were showing capacity in the 5 tenets of personalized learning across the district, but one of the other highlighted pieces to this in working with the pilot specifically was we want people who are really going to be eager to learn and eager to shift their thinking. So it may not be that they're super high flying in competency-based instruction yet, but we need someone who's willing to have conversations with other people and say, you know, I was thinking this, but now here's what I'm thinking. And then at the end, here's where I shifted to. Because we know that personalized learning, as you've seen in the previous slides, is a complete shift in learning for everyone involved. It's not just about the students, but it's about shifting pedagogy across the district, across multiple layers that we're noticing. And again, that highlights the need for a pilot with this, is to say, in order to really do this work, it can't just be a worksheet. It can't just be here's a quote-unquote project with your criteria attached that may or may not be tied to a rubric that's really an authentic assessment of your work. But how are you really showing us that you understand what that competency said and how you can demonstrate mastery of that?
Very good answer, and helpful too. One question I had that I wanted to go back to is, you know, where projects can vary quite a bit as you're getting your feet on the ground and this is getting underway. In terms of this workflow of the feedback loop here, is there a platform you're using, or is this just something that is guidance for the teachers to work through? Like, is there a platform to manage the work?
So we're using Blender, our learner profile platform, and we've actually built, with the help of Aaron and Karen and Jay and myself, we've actually sat down with our technology guys at Blender and we've built this out. I would say, and I think Aaron would probably be honest enough to say that we feel like we're in the beta version of it. It's not quite as intuitive as we would want it, which again is a good reason for the pilot right now, is to have teachers in the field with actual students, K through 12, looking at it, working through it. How does it work for you? And then getting the feedback. So part of this feedback loop is them giving feedback to us then and saying what works well, what doesn't work well, how can we improve the products before we really say, everybody, here's what we think is a really great way to measure student agency or to track student agency over time. But we are using Blender and it's all digital.
Got you. That was my question. And then another question, are there particular subjects or grade levels that seem to be emerging in this initial work?
So I wouldn't necessarily say, well, I mean, if you're talking about competency-based instruction, I don't really know that I could answer that well. But our pilot teachers run the spectrum. We purposefully, we started with asking for teachers in science and social studies because those were not state measured courses. And so because of the timing of this pilot, it's kind of leading up to our state mandated testing. We asked for teachers to kind of not feel like it's one additional piece to add to their plate right now. However, in making sure we had people that had the teacher agency themselves, we've got people that, again, run the gamut. I think we're as low as 3rd grade. I don't think we do have right now any kindergarten, 1st or 2nd grade teachers in the pilot for purposes of usability in the platform at the moment. But we've got everywhere from 3rd grade to 12th grade teachers, everywhere from ELA and math to, like I said, a high school Spanish teacher, and everywhere in between, because we have competencies built out for every course in the district. So, or every content area, excuse me, in the district. So really, realistically, anyone can use the platform. And we actually, after introducing this to our principals, I know we have teachers in other schools that are starting to play around with it, but they're just not an official part of the pilot right at this moment.
Got you. That's what I was asking. Great.
And so, Melissa, I have a notion about how the pilot teachers are responding. What about other more reluctant adopters that are moving toward competency-based? How are you handling support for teachers when they hit the wall, when they experience frustration, when this seems so different from what they thought they would be doing?
So that's kind of how we advertise the pilot, to be very honest. We advertised it with these people would be getting some additional one-on-one support. So one of the examples to that would be the one-day training that we held after Jay and I sat down and really talked through. We've done a lot of surveys with these particular teachers to find out what they say their specific needs are. Jay then went and met with every single pilot teacher one-on-one during their planning period and talked through the survey results with them and really got a sense of, so what do you really need from us in terms of support? Do you need more support on the tech side? Do you need more support on the competency-based side? What is it that you need from us to make this a successful pilot? Then after Jay gathered all of those results, that's when he and I sat down and talked through what is it that we really need to offer these teachers. And at the end of the day, that was when we came to the decision to offer them a full day out of the classroom. Let's talk about these elements. Let's talk about the conversation. Let's talk about feedback. And out of our 34 teachers, we had, I think, 28 attended the full day training. The other 6 were out for various reasons, whether they were sick or had another training scheduled for that day. But 28 of them came to the full day. And what we were able to offer them during that full day session was a lot of collaboration with one another. And what was fascinating about that, and I think Karen can speak to that because she was there in the morning session, was when we were tying it, we really planned out the day to first spend time tying the feedback loop to the work that we're doing as a district as a whole. So this didn't seem like one other thing that they were being asked to do, but that this really ties together everything we're talking about. It ties together the technology enabled. It ties together the learner profile. It brings together the idea of rigorous, authentic work. It brings student agency to the forefront. It's about authentic learning. It's all of those pieces of the Parthenon come together at a head with this feedback flow. And so once Karen and I and Jay really spent time talking that through with teachers, we really literally saw a lot of the light bulb moments happening just in that morning 1 hour presentation / discussion with them. We then moved into demonstrating the tool so that they had an idea of, oh, that's what you're talking about, because we really wanted to do it live with them before we ever said, now look at your work. We also had them complete, go ahead.
I just want to say we masterfully planned that intentionally so that it would all come together like that. And,
Yeah, you did.
so just know that, we just did that on purpose, and it just, it was well thought out and well planned.
Right.
And,
That goes
everything
without saying, Aaron. You didn't even have to say that.
So what it reminds me of too, Melissa, is that we've talked a lot that until teachers experience the same kind of messiness and complexity that their kids are experiencing in personalized environments, we're not going to be able to move the profession there. So I think your all's model is a great example of helping the adult learners learn the system while being a part of it as they help their young learners.
And that's one of the pieces that we really emphasized throughout the day was, you came in with this one idea of here's what you thought you were going to do, but through collaboration, both with like-minded teachers, so originally we had them grouped in elementary, middle, and high, but then we asked them to swap based on their content area. So as a science teacher doing a science piece of work, I want you to sit down with a high school science teacher from an elementary to high school perspective and get feedback from one another there. Because one of the things that we talked about as a district holistically is if teachers aren't experiencing for themselves the nature of personalized learning, if they're not experiencing sessions that are giving them the time to really wrestle through real rigorous problems themselves, then how can we then have them turn that to a classroom when they've never experienced it? So them walking through it themselves saying, this is what I thought I was going to do, and then them walking out the door and saying, here's how my thinking has changed, really gave them a sense of this is what your classroom should look like now. Not that it's about the technology piece of it, although we want to use the technology to monitor their processes, but really the conversations that are happening between you are so much more important throughout the work that's happening in your classroom when students are engaged in authentic, rigorous work than it is about the final end piece of the puzzle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think from a leadership standpoint, we've really approached this as a change process. Like all of the leaders in this, from district leaders to school level leaders to teacher leaders, are trying to manage what is loose and what is tight for all the learners up and down the whole entire school experience for kids. And so what's happening now is teachers are beginning to advocate for a level of teacher agency. The district is, and the school leadership are modeling the kind of learning circumstances they'd like to have for students. They're modeling that for teachers. And so, Aaron just put the comment in the box there saying students don't understand agency until teachers understand what is their level of agency. The district has provided schools with their level of agency with the loose-tight process through school redesign. But that whole loose-tight and where is my agency in all this conversation is happening up and down the whole entire line. Part of it, a big part of it, is defining what is mastery and then saying it's okay to take multiple pathways to that and use multiple pieces of evidence that you have demonstrated mastery of this thing. So we are talking a lot about competencies, not just with content in the 4 C's, but teacher competencies, leader competencies, school level competencies of what it means to operate in a 21st century kind of model of schooling. It's really an interesting conversation that is a significant shift from what we were talking about 5 years ago. So that's all exciting work and connects up a lot of pieces. And I have to say, Melissa does a great job connecting the conversations about depth of knowledge and authentic learning and technology enabled and rigor to the feedback loop, all under the personalized learning conversation for school. So as much as we can, we're continuing to remind them this is the direction that we're all pulling in, and the how might change along the way, but the why is never changing. We are committed to advancing student agency.
And I will say that your question about the reluctant teachers, even in this pilot, when we asked for high capacity teachers who would be encouraging and enthusiastic, we still found that we had teachers during the pilot training that are very reluctant, are very hesitant, are very nervous about doing this work. But I think throughout the day, we really did start to see a shift in the ideas. And so again, I think that gave us, and I think Aaron would even speak to that because he came in the afternoon and he was receiving questions, and the types of stopping points that teachers were having, the oh no moments, really started to revolve just around the technology piece and wasn't necessarily about the conversation and the paradigm shift we were asking them to have anymore.
I think the one thing that is buried in all of that work that has to be surfaced and can't just be let to people to figure out is this idea about kids demonstrating mastery and giving evidence, and the kids being responsible for saying why this is worthy evidence and not making the teacher the arbiter of all of that. That would be the one thing that I don't see deeply in the literature. It's kind of underneath, it's between the lines. But that's the piece that we think it really makes all of this different. It's not about giving a test so that teachers know exactly where kids' deficiencies are and then making a diagnosis of that and a prescription to fix it. It's about having kids have the ability to do that for themselves because they get led to that by their teacher. And so that's a really different way of thinking about the work of teachers and the work of assessment for learning, because most of the assessment for learning literature that's out there is about how to make teachers really good at diagnosing kids. And we think that that needs to be a co-created experience. So as they go through this feedback loop, one of the things that you see on there is number 6, where students have to develop an action plan. That's where the kids take the feedback and then have to do something with it. And that's really the thing that's different in all of this, is that we are putting the burden on the students. And they got to get coached up on it. They don't know how to do it when they first get started, and they're a little bit lazy, and they're used to teachers telling them what to do and being compliant and playing the game of school. So in the micro-credentialing work that you do, that would be one of the things that I would say you'd have to add if you were interested in the way we're thinking about this. But it's really about putting that burden on the students and understanding that teachers have to coach kids how to do that, but that doesn't mean giving them step-by-step directions, and that's not comfortable for lots of people.